So, based on what you have learned about the Renaissance this week, do you agree with John Green's assessment that the term Renaissance is not a useful for describing the time period? Um, so, in a lot of ways, this question comes back to our discussion around periodization in week one. Sort of how do historians choose to break up the past and put it into sort of more manageable chunks to understand? For a long period of time, the Renaissance has been sort of considered this age of rediscovery, where some people within Europe began to rediscover knowledge that had been created by the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans. Some of them were discovering information and discoveries that were coming from the Islamic Middle East. And actually, some of those manuscripts that were Greek and Romans were actually traded and transferred from the Islamic Middle East, where they had been using them for years, back into Europe. And that sort of sparked, to a certain degree, the sort of traditional idea of what the Renaissance was. And based upon this reintroduction of knowledge, there was sort of this sense around Europe, or once more among some in Europe, as John Green points out, that there had sort of been a glorious past in Europe with the Greeks and the Romans and the Roman Empire, and that through the decline of the Roman Empire and the medieval time period in Europe, that sort of glorious past had been diminished or lost. That Europe was the sense that they were not quite as advanced as they had been in previous time periods. And that during the Renaissance there was this attempt to try to rediscover what the past had been like, this idea of humanism, sometimes called, of trying to study history and find books and letters and manuscripts that are written in Latin or Greek, trying to translate them, trying to figure out what the world was like, looking at archaeology, what we consider archaeology today. That wasn't the word or term they would use for it then, but looking at the ruins of the Romans and the Greeks, how they had constructed buildings, how they had made statues, and trying to sort of recollect that and replicate that to a certain degree within European art styles. Another idea that's typically linked to this time period is individualism, where artists and researchers and musicians were really trying to hone their skills to a much higher level for their own sort of benefit and accomplishment. Through the medieval time period, you can really see Europe being defined very much by sort of collectivist values. That most of the time, the sort of importance that was being placed wasn't necessarily on one's individual skills or accomplishments, but how much they were going to be able to help the group, how much they're going to be able to help the group survive, or a lot of times this idea was very much tied to how strong the church and sort of religion was at this point in time, and how much you were going to be able to sort of, your emphasis and attention should be on sort of your spiritual duties, not necessarily sort of these artistic endeavors and so forth. So if you see the art styles in the medieval time period, there's really not much emphasis on realism in there. They oftentimes are very much devoted to religious themes. They're very much more interested in sort of telling a visual story. Almost, you might want to think of it kind of like a comic book today. Even though some comic books, of course, are very much tied to realism, but that wasn't necessarily the point. So eventually, when you get to the Renaissance style, there's this development of brand new art styles, with the biggest central focus being around realism. So if you're going to paint a picture of a woman, you want to make sure that she looks as much as lifelike and like a woman as possible. If you're going to create a picture of a building, it should look exactly how that building looks. If you are going to be, creating a sculpture of a human being, the anatomy should look really, really well. The muscles should all look exactly like a human being looks. They should be standing in a pose that you'd see a person standing in. So really trying to sort of replicate and bring in the sense of realism was very important in these sort of new artistic styles. And that's sort of where it began. And from there, then there was a sense that they wanted to try to take it farther. Like, we already sort of replicated what the ancient peoples could do. Now let's sort of improve upon it, and let's see sort of how grand we can get with this. And that was sort of the foundations of sort of the traditional understanding of what the Renaissance time period was. Now, John Green, of course, points out that there's a number of flaws with using the Renaissance as sort of a point of reference within history, using it as a distinct time period. He points out the fact that the majority of people living at this time period had no contact with the Renaissance. It was primarily limited to a number of small Italian cities or city-states, some larger cities, but very much it did not trickle out to the majority of the people who were living in rural areas, who were farming, and a lot of people didn't have any direct impacts by or from this time period and these developments that were happening or taking place. Also says that people at the, he also points out that people at the time period didn't consider themselves sort of living in this new age, or at least most people didn't. Certainly some of the people who were interested in collecting these, works and volumes and finding these books and trying to replicate it in the artists and so forth, they certainly might have felt like they were part of something that was at least different than had come before them in the past. But it wasn't something that was sort of widely considered or known by most people. And also he points out that the Renaissance as a time period spans over 300 years. So it's hard to sort of compare a person at one end of it to another end of it, because they're essentially living in sort of very different worlds within Europe. So sort of questioning about just exactly how accurate is it to use the term the Renaissance. And to a certain degree, I mean, he's very right in a lot of these criticisms, but I think at some level you could have these same issues with almost any time period that historians use. You could have this same discussion about the Bronze Age, for example. People in the Bronze Age wouldn't have necessarily known that they were living in a distinct time period. They wouldn't have called it the Bronze Age. And it would have spanned a long time period encompassing a lot of different peoples and cultures who were very different from each other. So almost any time period you want to consider, and any version of periodization you want to use, is probably going to run into some of these same issues. And it sort of gets to the heart of the concept around periodization. If you don't talk about the Renaissance at all, how do you take into account, in fact, the elements that did happen during this time period that ultimately do go on to have some pretty profound change, not just in their own time periods, but moving forward? Really, this is a time period of really great change overall. Remember, this is really coinciding with the exploration and colonization of the Americas that we talked about the last few weeks. It's also going to overlap with the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. So there's this huge religious upheaval that's going to be occurring at this same point in time. You see the conglomeration of larger and more powerful national states happening. And essentially, a lot of historians have sort of come to call this overarching period the early modern period of history within European history. And some people just sort of feel okay with sort of lumping the Renaissance in with that, but it seems like when you're talking about those distinct shifts in artistic styles, the development of the idea of sort of humanism and individualism, the Renaissance still has some use to, at least for people who associate it with those elements, to sort of have that point of reference. Because certainly those elements, while they might not have been greatly known to the people at the time and influential directly to the people at the time, do go on to have a lot of far-reaching influences in later movements. For example, the shift towards Christian humanism was first of all based off the secular humanism, trying to find the most accurate depictions of ancient writing and Latin and history that could possibly be found. Eventually people started taking those ideas and saying, well, we should do that same thing with religious text, particularly the Bible. And that's one of the things that starts kicking off the Protestant movement and the Reformation. So without those elements, even if they were moderately contained in the Renaissance time period, it's entirely possible you wouldn't have the Reformation. Same thing with the new science, how so much of the new science was based off of these sort of humanistic ideas of observation and trying to go back and look at what had been researched before and trying to figure out, does that match with our current understandings and our current observations? That's very much important with the development of science. Eventually, the Enlightenment, which is another very important intellectual movement we're going to be talking about in a few weeks here, is very much based upon some of these concepts coming from the Renaissance. So I'm not quite sure how you can take the Renaissance out and still sort of talk about how important these individual elements are quite as effectively as if you still have it at least in there as some sort of point of reference. But I think John Green is very right where you have to be very careful where and how you use it, because he is very correct that the people of the time period didn't conceptualize it in the same way that we do today, and we shouldn't think of them as having done so. In what ways was the Reformation a religious revolution? In what ways was it a political revolution? And what were some of the most important aspects or impacts the Reformation had on Europe? To really start thinking about the Reformation, you need to sort of establish what came first, and that was essentially the Catholic Church in medieval Europe. The Catholic Church eventually or originally gained such a sort of powerful position within the continent during the time period of sort of the decline of the Roman Empire. As the Roman Empire in the West was becoming more decentralized, and a lot of the former imperial governing systems were breaking down, the church really stepped in to fill a power gap which was left with those sort of declining infrastructures of the Roman Empire. And moving into sort of the medieval time period, the church really became kind of a central figure to everyday life. If you look at sort of the main sacraments of the church that people were supposed to sort of adhere to, essentially they were kind of the major touch points in people's lives was all supposed to be sort of funneled through sort of the church apparatus, whether it was baptism at birth, whether it was getting married, whether it was last rites before death. All of them were supposed to essentially, at all these very important parts of your life, were supposed to be sort of touching base with the church in some way, shape, or form. The church also, because it was filling not just a sort of religious gap, but also a political gap, in a lot of ways controlled and gained a lot of political power as well. And throughout the medieval period, there was a lot of sort of back and forth and power playing between secular kings, because there were still kings in locations such as England and France, and what's eventually called the Holy Roman Empire, which is not to be confused with the Roman Empire itself. They are two very different political entities. The Holy Roman Empire is a location that today is much more sort of associated with Germany, Austria, Switzerland, that area of Europe. But anyways, so there was a lot of interplay and sort of competition going on between these secular rulers of these kingdoms and the Catholic Church, based in Rome, which to a certain degree was sort of in theory supposed to have political control over all the people who believed in Christianity, which was at this point in time most of Europe. And the secular rulers trying to sort of get more of that power to themselves. And through most of the medieval time period, the church was fairly successful at hanging on to this power. Now, the church went in various waves, as far as sometimes it leaned more to the political side, got involved. Oftentimes that would sometimes lead to a decline in their power, as people sort of saw them as more out for their own sort of personal interests rather than trying to actually fulfill their religious obligations. And that sometimes they try to sort of reinvigorate the religious aspects of the church, try to reform themselves, and would oftentimes then get more power because people felt that they were a more legitimate entity. And this sort of went in waves throughout the medieval time period. One important sort of note towards the end of the medieval time period, moving into the early modern period, is the Great Schism, which occurred, where essentially you had a division in the Catholic Church, and really sort of a crisis of leadership. There were multiple popes who both claimed legitimacy at the same time, one of them in Avignon, France, one of them in Rome. Eventually there was a council called to try to sort it all out, and a third pope was elected, which neither of the other popes recognized. And this becomes a huge sort of legitimacy problem for the church, because most of their political power and religious power was based on the fact that the pope was supposed to sort of have this direct channel of legitimacy based upon all the way back to sort of the establishment of the church and the first pope, and that the fact that you now had sort of competing claims to this title really led to a loss of faith with some people within Europe. Eventually it gets sorted out, they're back to just having one pope again, but to a certain degree damage had already been done. And increasingly these secular kings are trying to find new ways to shake off sort of the power of the church and get more of that power onto themselves. Shortly after this time period, then you talk about sort of the beginnings of the Renaissance, if you want to think about that as a distinct time period, based upon our last conversation. But sort of that discovery of those ancient texts and that interest in ancient writings and history and literature, and Christian humanists then start trying to apply that to the Bible, saying we need to find the earliest versions of the Gospels, for example, or the earliest versions of these biblical stories that we can, or even just writings that came from this time period, and read them and see what the most accurate account is of this time period. So ultimately, that's going to lead to some people taking a closer, more critical look at the scriptures themselves, and not just sort of reading them, but starting to interpret them in new ways. And also, it comes with that very shortly after the idea to try to start replicating the Bible in other languages besides Latin. Through all the medieval time period, it had only been written in Latin, which, even though it was pretty much the language of scholarship around Europe, it was kind of the language of diplomacy around Europe, because sort of all the important diplomats and heads of states, that was sort of the common language they used. It wasn't a vernacular. I mean, your everyday average people did not speak Latin, which certainly, because oftentimes the sermons and religious lectures and so forth, the Bible was always only being read in Latin. The vast majority of the people within Europe had absolutely no idea what the Bible actually said. Some of it was relayed to them by priests and monks and people who were in charge of sort of relaying the messages to them, but they did not have the opportunity to really read and discover the Bible themselves. And the beginning of printing the Bible in different languages ultimately ends up having a huge impact on people being able to have sort of a direct link to the religious sources, so that they can sort of come up with their own ideas. Certainly one of the individuals who does this, and one of the first individuals, is Martin Luther, who's sort of credited to beginning the Reformation in general. And Martin Luther begins as a Catholic monk, and very quickly he starts having some issues with the church structure, with some of their practices, where he says some of these practices are only there to sort of benefit the church as an institution. It has nothing to do with really religion, and it's hurting my followers and my believers, the people who's sort of I'm lecturing to, and the people that I'm delivering sermons to. And he ultimately starts challenging the church on a number of these. One example was the selling of indulgences, where essentially the church would say, well, when you die, you sort of you don't go right to heaven. You sort of have to wait in this weird area known as purgatory for a while we sort of sort out what you did good and what you did bad during life. But we'll get you an easy get into heaven free card if you go ahead and pay us some money. So they're trying to get people to pay the church money so that they could get what was called an indulgence, so they could essentially get into heaven faster after they died. Martin Luther looked at this and said, well, there's nothing about purgatory or indulgences or anything like that in the Bible, or any sort of religious script that I can tell. So essentially this is something that the church is making up just to try to make money for themselves. So he comes out very heavily against indulgences. And that's just one example. There's a whole litany of other charges he makes against the church, that essentially the church was becoming much more of a bureaucratic entity and a political entity, and was ignoring its religious obligations. Now, Martin Luther, even though he sort of begins this Reformation time period, wasn't the first person to level these critiques against the Catholic Church. There had been other reformers before Martin Luther who leveled similar criticisms. And ultimately what happens to most of them is they are caught by the church and executed. And the biggest success that Martin Luther ultimately has is the fact that he's able to stay alive and continue preaching and continue to sort of pass this message out. And this begins what is known as Protestantism, sort of this reinterpretation of religion based upon direct readings of the Bible. That's sort of one of the big things that Martin Luther says. You have to be able to read the Bible and interpret it yourself and sort of come to your own conclusions. And ultimately, a lot of people around Europe start doing that. They start following this lead, much to the Catholic Church's chagrin. And ultimately what this ends up doing is sort of opening up Pandora's box, because once there isn't sort of one unified reading and one sort of unified voice behind these religious texts, people can start interpreting them in all sorts of different ways, which they ultimately end up doing. So very quickly after the Protestant sort of Reformation begins, you see a split between Lutherans on one side, following Martin Luther's teaching, and Calvins on the other side, following John Calvin and other early reformers' teachings. Soon you have the Anglican Church breaking off of this, and we'll be talking more about that in just a moment here. Eventually you have Scottish Calvinists and French Calvinists, and then those religions start dividing. So if you want to look at sort of the modern landscape of religion and the Christian religion today, it's made up of thousands of different sects and denominations and subsects that really you can trace back to this time period, and essentially anyone who can read and interpret the Bible in a different way can essentially form their own sect of the religion and start teaching that aspect and that element of it, which is why you get to the thousands that we have in our modern time period. Of course, the Catholic Church doesn't go anywhere. They are going to adapt and change and still be sort of a powerful sect in their own right. But the vast diversity that we have today really does relate back to this time period, and that's very much sort of how it was a religious revolution, where no longer was sort of all of the religion funneled through one entity, the Catholic Church. It's now being broken up into dozens, hundreds, eventually thousands. A few things lead to the importance of why this Reformation was successful. The first of all was the introduction of the printing press, the fact that you could print Bibles in these vernacular languages very fast, much faster than previously. Before the introduction of the printing press, anything you wanted to copy, you'd have to copy by hand, and it would take days and weeks and sometimes months to replicate one book. With the printing press, you could, it'd be a matter of hours, and you could have a new a copy of a book. So literature starts becoming much more widespread. That has a huge impact in this religious revolution. It's also going to have a huge impact on the scientific revolution we'll be talking about in just a moment. The other thing that aids this particular revolution, where others had failed, was just how accepting secular rulers were and how they decided to start using Protestantism as a tool against the Catholic Church. And that's really where the Reformation becomes a political revolution, because a lot of the secular rulers who had been looking for quite a while on a way to wrest power away from the Church realized that Protestantism was their avenue to do that. So, for example, very quickly you have Henry VIII of England saying, well, I want to get divorced from my wife. The Catholic Church isn't going to let me, so I'm going to take my ball, go home, and start my own religion, a better religion, which was the Anglican Church, which early on was the exact same thing as the Catholic Church. Henry VIII just set himself up as the head of the church rather than the Pope. Another example is that you have all these sort of feudal ties that bounded various regions to various lords and so forth. And a lot of times local rulers would use the adoption of a Protestant religion to try to break away from and separate themselves from whatever sort of feudal bonds that they had. So, for example, the Kingdom of Prussia breaks away from the Holy Roman Empire, gains more autonomy from the Holy Roman Empire by becoming very much devoted to Protestantism very early on in their history, and is able to use that to sort of start forming their own separate kingdom. And this is very beneficial because the first thing that the sort of lords of these regions do once they sort of declare themselves Protestantism is go in and take over all the churches with all their money and finances and gold within their region and set themselves up as the head of those new religions or as a big part of it, and is able to sort of accumulate the wealth that the church had for themselves. So it very much does tie into a growing political divide within Europe as well. So what are some of the most important impacts that the Reformation is going to have? One big, obviously, besides the religious revolutionary elements, is going to be the Counter-Reformation that the Church launches, because the Catholic Church realized that this was a huge problem. Without outright saying it, the Counter-Reformation was sort of them acknowledging, yeah, we've made a few mistakes. Here's how we're going to go about trying to fix it. So there is a sort of a redetermination to go back to the roots and the fundamentals of the religion, to actually make sure that they're trying to fulfill their religious obligations, to try to become sort of a less linked to politics. They never completely separate themselves from it, but trying to lessen that. And also trying to very much turn their view outwards. Because Spain stayed a Catholic country and Spain was so invested in the New World, one of the biggest elements of the Counter-Reformation was trying to convert American Indians and other people around the world to Catholicism to try to sort of offset the losses that Protestantism had incurred. Of course, the increased power in secular states is oftentimes tied to this as well, that you really see the launching of sort of that absolutism within these dynasties, a lot more power being funneled to the monarch because the power of the church was essentially diminished to a certain degree within the varying countries and states. You also see increased competition and war within Europe between these states, as some states stayed Catholic, some states turned Protestantism, and that was just essentially one more reason for these rulers to dislike each other, to go to war against one another, to compete with one another. And really sort of heightens the competition, which had always been there to a certain degree, but only brings it to new levels. A good example of this and how it actually gets very much tied into sort of society in general is the idea of witch hunts. Sort of contrary to popular belief, witch hunts really weren't conducted during the medieval time period. It really wasn't until the Reformation, where people sort of had this fear of Catholics or Protestants within their communities, that you start having people being accused of not just being a different religion, but tying in with worshiping the devil and being really terrible people that we need to sort of root out and kill. Of course, most of them were just innocent people who might have had some sort of medical issue, or for some reason were an outcast within society, which were going to be targeted by this. But you can really sort of view this new religious fear back to this Reformation time period. And of course, a lot of people had a much closer relationship with their religion after this time period. The fact that the Bible was opened up to new languages, people were reading it for the first time, interpreting it for the first time, and certainly the reforms that the Catholic Church is going to make, while not completely going back on sort of the traditions of commitment to Latin and so forth, is going to have some of those same effects as, a lot of people within Europe actually become a lot more religious after this time period because of these various revolutions which were taking place, whether the Reformation or the Counter-Reformation. What do you see as some of the advantages to absolute monarchy? What was best, or who was best served by this political system? What do you see as some of the drawbacks or disadvantages to absolute monarchy, and who was not well served by this political system? So the class did a very good job with this question, I thought. A lot of you pointed out that one of the biggest benefits of absolute monarchy is that it's really easy to get things done. Certainly one of the drawbacks of a democratic or republic society as we currently live in, which a lot of people are certainly seeing, is that sometimes it can be extremely difficult to just get things done, to pass laws, to pass bills, to have important conversations about where you want the country to go. And that a lot of times is kind of like trying to steer a cruise ship, how things almost happen at a glacial pace. Because a lot of people have different ideas, everyone wants to sort of have their time to speak and discuss, and that you can't just snap your fingers and make things happen. Now, certainly that can be very, very frustrating, and is very frustrating to a lot of people who live in governmental systems where there are more people who have a say. Obviously, if you just have one person or a small group of people with all the power making all the decisions, they can just sort of snap their fingers and get things done. Rather than thinking about a government like a cruise ship and taking a long time to change course, with an absolute monarchy, it can be like a speedboat and it can just go zipping whichever which way. That can be a pro and it can be a con. Sometimes it's a really good thing that you actually take your time to think things out and work on detailed ideas and decisions and legislation and so forth, where if you just start ham-fistedly putting things out there, it can cause a lot more harm than good. But certainly it avoids the frustration of some of that sort of bureaucracy, which can occur when you have more people at stake, and more people, or I should say, with a stake, and more people with a voice in the conversation. Also, it's very easy then to have a clear direction. If an absolute monarch says we're going to go to war, pretty much the people underneath him are going to say okay and fall in line. If he's going to say we're going to sign this treaty, everyone's going to be falling in line essentially. Not all the time, but in general, that's the idea behind absolute monarchy, that there's sort of one person with the decision-making power. It can also be very easy to accumulate power in this sense. If you sort of have a strong ruler with a strong nobility and backing him up with a willing peasantry and population, it can be pretty easy to create a relatively strong state. And that's probably one of the reasons why you see, for the most part, a lot of the large kingdoms and empires which have been formed throughout history were conducted and done so with some sort of kingship model or absolutist type system. Not all of them. You can certainly take example the Roman Republic as an example of creating a large empire while having a non-monarchical system of government. But that was really much more of an aberration. And until you get to sort of the modern world, where you have countries like the United States are essentially replicating and doing the same things without a monarchical system, this is sort of the way that a lot of the large kingdoms and empires which are formed are going to be formed. So what are some of the drawbacks and disadvantages? Well, like I mentioned, a lot of the advantages also have sort of their opposite side too, right? Like I said, I mean, making decisions really easily can be really good. It can also be very, very detrimental. Everything works great. Like I said, if you have those three components, if you have a strong leader with a nobility who's sort of willing to back them up, with a population that's willing to sort of go along with it and bear the burden. But if you take out any of those three elements, you can start having really a lot of problems. Certainly, like one person sort of mentioned, it's kind of like a coin flip, whether or not you're going to get a ruler that's really strong, and especially if you're talking about European kingdoms where primogeniture, or just sort of handing everything over to the firstborn son, regardless of how good or poorly he was at leading, can certainly lead to some very poor rulers and leaders, which can have some very bad consequences. Because you don't want, the sort of people around the king, his court and his government and so forth, spending most of their time trying to keep a leader out of trouble and destroy their country, which sometimes ultimately ends up happening. I also want to mention the people who are best served by this. Obviously, the king or the monarch is going to be very well served. People within his sort of elite group are going to be very well served by this. Obviously, a strong noble class oftentimes is associated with absolutism and kingship, where there is going to be a very strong sort of upper class which is benefited by keeping this ruler in power. And oftentimes within Europe, the church as well is going to be very much benefiting from this. Remember, a lot of the idea of sort of where political power came from in the medieval and moving into the early modern time period was from God, sort of handed through the church and by the church then on to leaders. Remember, in a lot of these sort of coronation and ceremonies, it's a religious figure who actually places the crown on the king's head, with the idea that sort of the church is giving the ruler the right to rule. We already talked about how there was this increasing tendency for these secular rulers to try to be stealing power away from the church, and even when they do, they still sort of oftentimes have ties to the church, even though the church maybe is still ceremonially placing the crown on their head, but everyone knows that crowns getting placed there regardless of what the church says. Still, oftentimes in these locations, the church is going to be one of those branches of the population which is going to be fairly well served by having a strong authoritarian leader at the top. Of course, another drawback to the system is really having no say in government for the vast majority of the population. Many of the people who are living there aren't going to have any say in what laws are passed, any say in going to war or not going to war, any say in taxation. And that kind of leads me to another element who was not served. Essentially, for most of European history, the burden of taxation was placed entirely on the lower classes. The nobility were oftentimes exempt from taxation. The church was oftentimes exempt from taxation. So all of the money to try to run these increasingly expensive governments was coming directly from the majority of the population who were peasants, who didn't have any political say. Of course, once you get up to the time period of the Enlightenment, which we'll be talking about next week, there's plenty of ideas of people saying, hey, this is backwards and shouldn't be sort of the way things are. If people are going to be sort of paying taxes, they should have some sort of say, which of course is where some of those ideas that our country is based around are first going to be created and developed. So we'll be talking about that more when it comes to the Enlightenment time period. But until you get to that time period, this was pretty much sort of the status quo, with the vast majority of the population not having a lot of input, and sort of having to go along with it, just sort of hoping that they get a good ruler with a stable governing system who actually sort of has their own best interests in mind, and not only the interests of whoever the ruler is, their family, the nobility, and the clergy. For this question, I thought the class were a great group of time travelers. I thought you did a very good job of figuring out if you were going to go back in time, who you'd talk about, what questions you'd ask, and so forth. Some of the examples of historic figures that people chose, there was a lot of people choosing Martin Luther, some people choosing Galileo, some people choosing Michelangelo, Nicholas Copernicus, Charles V. So yeah, some very good choices here, and I thought there were some really interesting questions being asked, sort of questions about motivation, technical questions about how exactly did you develop the telescope, or the idea of the heliocentric universe. So yeah, some very good questions that people were thinking of asking their historic figures, and I really liked the way that you thought about what you wanted to tell them. A lot of times this was sort of looking at the world it is today and telling them, hey, this is what your contribution led to. Looking at Martin Luther and saying, the religion that I am a part of, or that a lot of people are part of, is directly related to these changes that you made. Some people saying these are some of the sort of positives and some of the cons that came along with the Protestant Reformation. Looking at the scientists and asking, or and telling them, this is sort of what the world looks like today. How much of our modern world is based upon your discoveries and the discoveries of other scientists like you, the development of the scientific method, and also trying to sort of pinpoint all the sort of technology that we have around us today, and how much of that is based upon sort of this rising of scientific knowledge and information. So yeah, overall I don't have too much to add on here, because these are obviously sort of very sort of personal answers that people were creating, but overall very good job. What do you consider to be the 5 most important developments that helped spawn the new science? For each development, make sure to explain how and why it ended up impacting science in Europe. So a lot of people started with linking the new science back to the Renaissance time period. Or at least some of the elements that are oftentimes associated with the Renaissance time period. Humanism, for example, the idea of trying to accurately go back and depict the past, figure out what the past knowledge was, and then trying to improve upon that. Essentially, the beginnings of science dealt with this a lot, of looking at what does our knowledge of the universe tell us. Primarily that knowledge came from the ancient Greeks, for example, Aristotle. And then saying what parts of it match with what we are now seeing around us, and what parts of it don't. And the parts that don't, trying to think of a new reason for why those differences might be there. So humanism has a huge impact of just getting much more knowledge and into Europe in general. Also the idea of Hermetic thinking, right? The idea of using observation, experimentation, and reason to try to arrive at truth. And reason only so far is sort of backed up by experimentation. Very much a new way of thinking to a certain degree within Europe, of not just sort of going with tradition and sort of what had come before it, but thinking much more critically about the world around you, and then using a much more systemic way of trying to accumulate knowledge, not just based on assumptions, but based on all these factors that I have mentioned. And most importantly, what a lot of people mentioned, the certain thing that sort of tied all this new science together, was a common shared language, that being mathematics. The fact that not only could you observe and do the experiments, but that you would actually had a way to start quantifying and qualifying what you're observing, and using it and writing it in a language that anyone could read, that made sense to anyone who sort of understood how math worked, and that could then be replicated and explained. So not only are you sort of making these observations, but you're saying, here's what I'm observing, and this is why it works, and this is why it makes sense, if that's the way you want to think of it. Of course, inductive reasoning is a big part of this as well, right? That you sort of use all these things in your way to build up a knowledge base. And of course, just like with the Reformation, the printing press has a huge impact as far as sharing these ideas. So that now it's not just one person thinking about a problem or looking at a discrepancy, it's dozens, it's hundreds, all thinking about this, all making observations, oftentimes all communicating with one another through messages and notes and letters, but also having people's work published in books and larger volumes, which can be easily replicated and printed using the printing press. Just like the Reformation, without the printing press, there's no way that the scientific revolution would have been as large, as widespread, or impactful as it ultimately was. And a lot of people also pointed out some great specific examples coming from individual people. The discoveries of Copernicus, realizing that in our solar system, the Earth revolves around the sun, not the other way around. Realizing that all the observations that Galileo made, the development of the telescope, mapping out what the moon looked like, discovering all the various planets in our solar system. Boyle and his experiments on gases, and realizing that one particular ancient idea Epicureanism, which really postulated the idea, it was created by the ancient Greeks, that the universe was constructed of tiny particles called atoms, and that's sort of what made everything within the universe. Boyle actually sort of proves that that is right and that is true. So you have sort of a rediscovery of the scientific world of sort of the ancient Greeks that wasn't necessarily as common as Aristotle's logic, but Boyle ends up proving it ultimately being a little bit more accurate, and that brings sort of Epicureanism back as a not just a philosophy, but also it's sort of its own religion in its own right, which starts becoming very influential in the new Enlightenment time period. And of course you have Bacon sort of formulating all these into the scientific method, saying we need a way that we can all sort of do the same process using this inductive reasoning and hermetic thinking, using observation and experimentation, making these experiments repeatable so that we can have once more sort of a common language that we can discuss the science in, and sort of codifying that becomes very important. And then you have Isaac Newton, absolutely brilliant, does experiments in all sorts of areas of the natural world, very much the creator of physics, and takes mathematics to a whole new level, and really distinctly shows just how much of our world is defined by these natural laws of science. Very, very important things, and the class did a great job of sort of pointing out how all of these were very, very important discoveries in their own right. Alright, moving on to our primary source discussion. Before we begin, just a few reminders on primary sources. Make sure that your answer to each one of the questions are at least 100 words in length. A good way to increase your length is to add in direct quotes. I'm going to also say that making sure you put specific examples is also very important. A lot of students who were missing points this week were missing it because you just didn't have enough specifics from the document itself. So adding in quotes is a really good way to kill two birds with one stone. It'll make your answer longer. It'll also use specific examples, so it'll help you get points for both of those categories. Also, make sure when you're responding to another student that your answers are at least, or your response is at least 50 words in length. So sometimes you're only writing one or two sentences, make it 3 or 4. If you want to comment on another part of their answer, something else that you agree with, or something else that you interpreted a little bit differently, or maybe just let them know what you thought about a particular question if it was different from theirs, or maybe even write, I like your answer. This is really where the document, says it. If they didn't put a quote in theirs, you can write a quote from the document back at them saying this is exactly what you're talking about. So those are all ways to increase the length in your responses to other students. But make sure you are getting those word lengths up there for all the questions. Remember, 100 words for each of the question in your answers, and then 50 words to another student in your response. So moving on to the document itself. In what ways do these documents demonstrate the emerging principles of Western science? Overall, I thought the class did a pretty good job here looking at sort of breaking it down to a number of key areas. First of all, they all, to one degree or another, show the importance of observation. Whether it's Copernicus, whether it's Galileo, whether it's Bacon, they're all talking about how important observation is, that these are essentially phenomenon that they have observed. For example, in Copernicus's case, saying that I observed, that the Earth is in motion just like the other planets in the solar system. We were moving in the sort of the exact same manner, and that means that we are sort of orbiting the sun. Galileo, he talks about his observations that he has made throughout the universe as well. Bacon really sort of takes observation to the next level, saying sometimes simply observing with your eye isn't precise enough, that we need to use instruments and instrumentation in order to get an even more accurate depiction of what is going on. But to one degree or another, they are all talking about observation. They also contain a lot of information on the importance of mathematics. Both Galileo and Copernicus talk about sort of their calculations and how it's not just their observation, but it's the observation and then sort of the math to back it up that goes along with it. So that's another sort of important element. And of course, Bacon is very much talking about how math is sort of used in instrumentation to help once more make calculations and sort of see things that are beyond our senses. Galileo and Copernicus are very much sort of saying these are what our senses are telling us. Bacon's sort of taking it to the next level. How can we see things that our naked eye can't? Obviously, you use things like a microscope to see things that are too small, or go about finding, if we know something's there but we can't see it, how can we find it out? You can go back to Boyle's experiments to try to figure out, pressure and realize that, hey, everything's made up of these tiny particles. So Bacon is sort of saying mathematics is one of those ways that we can find information even if it's beyond our sensory perceptions. Of course, the importance of experimentation is also very much element and present in these documents, very much in Bacon's, but to a certain degree in Galileo's and in Copernicus's as well, because they both say that this isn't just me who has made these observations. Other people have made them as well. Copernicus saying, the only reason I'm publishing this is because my friends told me I had to. Galileo is essentially sort of refuting his critics, saying, the only reason they're saying this is because they haven't actually, sort of done these experiments. If they would have seen the same thing I did, they would be coming to the same conclusion. I love the line he has in there saying, people are acting like I'm the one who sort of put these things in the sky. He's saying, no, I'm just sort of recording what is there, and if they want to do the same thing that I did and follow the same procedures, they'll come to the same conclusions. So all these to a certain degree are getting at the principle that nature can be understood and explained in some way. And that's sort of the core theme from this sort of early round of science here. That nature is something that can be understood, that it has natural laws. These laws are always going to be the same, and they're going to apply equally in all circumstances. And once you identify them, you can sort of increase your knowledge of the world and how it works. So all these are very good ways of how they are demonstrating these principles of Western science. So what was new and revolutionary about these ideas and principles? Certainly for Copernicus, just the idea that the Earth is in motion, that it's always moving, which means that the sun sort of has to be the stable thing and sort of the center of the universe, very much is contradictory to sort of the Aristotle version of the universe, which said essentially the Earth is the center and everything is sort of rotating around us. Copernicus says, "Oh, that doesn't make any sense compared to what I'm observing. What my calculations say that couldn't possibly be true. The only way the math makes sense is if we are the ones that are moving around sort of the central point, which would be the sun." Galileo, of course, he's talking about his astronomical observations. Him being the first person to ever observe these planets or these moons out in the solar system. And another very sort of new and revolutionary idea that Galileo brings in is this idea that what should be the basis of knowledge is not scripture but observation. It should be the natural world, not what's being interpreted in text. He sort of says that he says sort of that the Bible is infallible, but interpretations of the Bible can be. He says a lot of times, the Bible says things that people interpret in very different ways, so that can't be the basis of knowledge. I love the quote that he uses at the end of his document that says, "We conclude that God is known first through nature, and then again, more particularly, by doctrine." So pretty much saying if there's a conflict between what's written in the Bible and what we are observing in nature, that nature is what's going to take precedence. Very revolutionary idea here. One that's going to be essentially replicated by a lot of these early scientists as well as the early thinkers of the Enlightenment. They don't want to completely say that because there's discrepancy, we're going to completely throw religion out. Not at all. A lot of them still were very religious themselves, but they come to this conclusion that allows them to sort of still have these conflicts. They essentially say, what we're doing are discovering laws that God created, and that's how we are sort of observing and directly interacting with God, is by sort of discovering the laws of the natural world, that there's nothing heretical about that. Certainly some people within the church were going to argue and fight back against this idea, and that some of these early scientists are actually attacked and executed and killed. Galileo was actually imprisoned for a number of years. But as time goes on, increasingly, the scientists and the people who are working in this field are going to sort of come to that same conclusion, that there's more than one way to sort of get in touch with the divine, and that trying to discover these natural laws is essentially one way of just trying to sort of communicate with whatever force it was that created them. Another sort of revolutionary idea was very much sort of the rules of experimentation which Bacon is setting up, and the use of instruments. And once more, trying to take this idea of observation and using our senses to know the world to the next level, and saying there are ways that we can sort of experience the world that our senses can't. But that doesn't mean that it's not true, that it's not there, that there's still a way for us to sort of get to those natural laws, even the ones that we can't see, taste, smell, or hear. So what role does religion play in these documents, and how do the authors have to reconcile their ideas with traditional religious doctrine? We already talked about this a little bit with Galileo, and it's interesting, sort of the time that these three documents were written, Copernicus being first, Galileo second, Bacon third, how their attitudes really are shifting towards religion and the position of the church in general. Looking at Copernicus, his letter is almost apologetic. It's like he's almost apologizing to the Pope for making these discoveries. He's like, listen, I didn't mean to cause trouble. I don't want, the only reason I'm publishing this is because my friends told me I should. But he sort of says, I'm sorry, but these are the observations I'm making. This is what I'm seeing, and I sort of have to report it. Galileo is much more defensive. He's not necessarily as apologetic as he is saying, hey, look, these are the observations I'm making. My critics are only critics because they're not actually reading the science behind my work. They're not actually using the same and doing the same observations that I am. And once more, he sort of makes that distinction that he thinks that sort of God should be known first through nature and then by doctrine. So very much sort of not necessarily completely going against religion, but saying the way that it's being sort of interpreted by the Catholic Church isn't the only way that it can be interpreted, and in fact he thinks that sort of his method is better. Very much more, I would say, aggressive than Copernicus's document, which Copernicus's was very much more, like I said, sort of apologetic. Galileo's much more defensive. And in Bacon's document, you see that religion really isn't a factor anymore. He's not even really considering, is this something that is going to be conflicting with religious doctrine in any way, shape, or form. Um, and of course, Bacon is going to be at a later time. He's also going to be operating not in a Catholic country, which Copernicus and Galileo were, but he's going to be in a Protestant country. And he's going to be operating at a time where really these secular kings and governments are going to start realizing the power behind the new science. Of course, understanding the natural world is what a lot of these scientists were interested in. Controlling the natural world is what a lot of these secular kings are interested in. So they see great value in the work of these scientists, and one of the reasons why they're going to give safe harbor to a lot of these scientists working within their borders. Eventually, these scientists actually become like national assets that some of them are specifically going to be hired by these kings to come into their countries to do experiments to find more knowledge that they think that they can somehow use to either weaponize it or to make them smarter or more capable than other kingdoms. So it's almost like science becomes politicized, in some cases militarized, fairly early on. Which is one of the reasons why I would say religion doesn't play nearly as much of a factor, particularly when you have this growing divide between sort of the religious power and sphere and the secular state power and sphere. And by the time you get to Francis Bacon, he's not even considering the impact that his work is going to have on religion. So thinking about question number 4, how do you think these documents fit into the emerging movement of Western science, and what impacts may they have had? In all their cases, they made contributions, I would say, really to building up this combined understanding of nature that is so central to the understanding of science. The accumulation of knowledge which led to an understanding of these natural laws. That was really sort of the end goal that a lot of these scientists had. Find these laws which dictate nature, which dictate how the world and the universe works. And once you define those laws, then you'll sort of have this much more clear understanding of the world around us. And in one shape or form, all three of these are doing that. Once more, you also have that relationship between science and religion, how it's sort of progressing throughout this time period and seeing the contributions that each of these scientists is making. And I'd say maybe the most important way that this is going to have an impact is that it's going to embolden others to continue the research that was set up. To test the hypothesis, to try to prove them wrong or incorrect, or prove them correct, to continue to sort of build on this knowledge throughout time. And that's essentially the same science which is being conducted in this time is the same science that's being conducted today. Once you have that scientific method of forming a hypothesis, developing an experiment, doing the experiment, and either publishing your results or going back and forming a new hypothesis based on the results, making sure that that experiment is repeatable. Those are all elements that we still use to understand the natural world around us today. And that's not to say that all of the knowledge that they came up with at this point in time was 100% accurate and correct. Of course, Newton had for a long time sort of been the hallmark of the knowledge of physics until the 20th century, where this new interloper named Albert Einstein came along and sort of blew a whole bunch of holes in Newtonian physics. Doesn't mean that Newton was incorrect. He was just observing what he could observe with the tools that he had and with the math that he had at his time. And by the 20th century, that's going to change. It's going to happen in a large number of the fields that we are going to be talking about, but the method that is being used to accumulate that knowledge, to test that knowledge, and change that knowledge is going to, in a lot of ways, be the same from this time period all the way up until our modern day.